I'm going to now hand over to my good colleague in Together for Change, Sue Denman, who is going to chair the meeting today. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much, Jessie. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to launch straight into the subject matter that we're covering this afternoon. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. That saying came from an author and management consultant called Peter Drucker. And by that, he didn't mean that strategy is unimportant. He meant simply that an empowering culture is a surer way to organizational success. And these are my words. I would add to that the success of collaborations and partnership working, which is so central to well-being and living well in our communities today. So organizational culture doesn't have to be all negative, but all too often we see the negative effects of strong shared values, norms, beliefs, when we see them in a way that stands in the way of progress. So this afternoon, we have 5 great speakers with extensive experience of the challenges that this presents and knowledge of how they can or could be overcome with practical and policy and actually research measures as well. So we have 5 people talking today, giving short presentations. Initially, we're going to start with Kate Arden, and then 4 people will chip in as a panel with their reactions to what they've heard from Kate. So it's my great pleasure to first introduce Kate Arden to you, who's actually a public health specialist from England. She is medically qualified, is a public health specialist, a member of the Faculty of Public Health, and she's had senior roles that have encompassed research, policy and practice in Liverpool and Greater Manchester, and was involved in the Wigan deal, which is often held up as a great example of success, of transformative change. When organizational barriers are broken down and things really happen in our communities. So after Kate has given her presentation, her talk, I will then hand over to the 4 sectoral speakers and will introduce them after Kate has completed her talk. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Sue, and good afternoon, everybody. From sunny Liverpool, I'm speaking, which obviously has very strong connections and affiliations with North Wales. And indeed, I've worked from time to time with colleagues in Public Health Wales, so I'm very familiar with your particular sets of circumstances and the way the system is organised. I'm going to talk to you about the journey that Wigan went on, which started back in 2010. And I'm going to talk about the 6 C's: camaraderie, collaboration, cooperation, community, culture, and communication. So those lessons, if you like, that Wigan learnt. We didn't get everything right, and it's still part of the journey. Nor is it a one-size-fits-all approach either. I think that's very, very important to emphasise right at the start. For those of you who don't know where Wigan is, it's the westernmost borough in the conurbation of Greater Manchester. And it is, in fact, the 2nd biggest borough in Greater Manchester after the city of Manchester itself. It has a population of 327,000. It's got a very proud industrial heritage. Of course, it's an ex-mining community and was at the heart of the Lancashire coalfield. It also has a very proud sporting tradition, the centre of rugby league. Sorry, Union folks, but the centre of rugby league, St Helens and Warrington will probably dispute that. It's very much a white working class borough, so 98% of Wigan's population is actually white. And it's also if you like, the fastest growing older population in Greater Manchester. That's actually quite a good thing, because it means the healthy life expectancy has actually improved, more of which later. But it has nearly 100,000 people in the borough living in the most deprived quintile. And in 2010, it faced a massive challenge. I'm going to say, the reason I've sort of given you that little snapshot of what Wigan is like is that, and this is really important, I guess, as an observation, geography matters. That's both the physical geography of where a place is located, its social geography, how people connect with each other, and its infrastructure. And that might be things like transport, but also the assets in a place are really important. History also matters. And often when we come from a healthcare or social care background, a science background, we ignore the humanities. Humanities are really important when it comes to culture and changing culture. So remember that. I'm going to come back to geography and history as I speak. The journey in Wigan has been a political one, it's been a professional one, and most importantly, it's been a public journey as well. And we embarked on that journey together. I think particularly for Neil, the role of elected members is absolutely crucial. This has to have political buy-in if you're going to actually look at how culture influences outcomes and the way you go about doing things. And I'm going to quote the deputy leader of Wigan Council, who's also the long-time portfolio holder for adult social care and health. He came into post when I did in May 2008. So throughout my time in Wigan, I worked with Keith. And he said that Wigan is developing a culture of giving good people the time and space to do great things. Evidence-based working is important, but evidence can only be achieved in the first place by trying something new. A lot in that statement, isn't there? The idea of giving people time and space to innovate is really important, but boy, is it scary. We are a risk averse in organisations, and we often have a blame culture. Evidence, we tend to narrow what we mean by evidence, and we tend to stick to what we're familiar with when actually we need to change. And having that political air cover to innovate, to take some risk, is really important. That's how you change culture. I would observe, I worked for the NHS for 27 years. I also worked for local government for 14. And for 5 years of that time, I actually overlapped between the two. So I worked across 2 cultures. And I would observe that the culture I grew up with in the NHS is very much around the expert on top. And we value people who are highly specialist. The culture in local government is quite different because of that democratic connection to place. And this was if you like, the challenge that faced Wigan in 2010, austerity. In other words, austerity was almost the grandmother of innovation. And the political journey that Keith and the then leader, Lord Smith of Lee, who sadly is no longer with us, went on, along with their other colleagues, was a growing sense of, we've got to take a massive hit out of the council budget. So, it was the 3rd biggest cut to council budgets in the whole of England. We had to, since 2010, have saved over £170 million out of the council's revenue budget. So there was a massive financial hit that the council had to take. And we could have gone down the usual route, which was salami slicing, And guess what? All the prevention, early intervention services go. We're seeing that to a certain extent that our colleagues in Birmingham are going through. They have other factors obviously impacting on their particular challenges. That's the standard route, isn't it? Cut the things that don't appear to matter. But of course, it's a false economy. Peter had been influenced very much by the work we were doing with troubled families. And he didn't like the language of that. We worked with Hilary Cotton, who may be familiar to some of you. And Peter sort of went through almost a eureka moment when he said, do you know, we keep doing things to people instead of co-creating with, and actually we're disabling people, we're disempowering them. So let's change the language, let's start to do things in a very different way. It happened at the same time that we were working with Nesta as one of the 6 creative councils across England. And this led to a very different dynamic with the community. People who we'd been, who were deemed to be, shall we say, troublemakers. Indeed, one of our brilliant community activists, Barbara Nettleton, who sadly passed away a few months ago, was, and she would have told you this, she was barred from Wigan Town Hall because she was that damn woman who was always complaining and causing trouble. Working with Nesta around the Scholes community, which Barbara was part of, that started a very different and a much more equal conversation. And it also led to us working with an anthropologist. I would recommend all organisations work with an anthropologist. I've always said the NHS needs a chief anthropologist to teach it how to talk to people. It was revelatory working with Robin Farrow on an anthropological approach. Instead of imposing a sort of top-down culture, a do-to culture with citizens, we started to train people in ethnography. Now, Robbie's going to be really pleased here because we spend a lot of time, do we not, writing cultures, strategies, solemnly writing them. They're often very large, very long, and they don't change things. Recently, I talked to a colleague about a social contract between the NHS in England and citizens. And I said, haven't you got one? It's called the NHS Constitution. To which the response was, yeah, well, that sits on a shelf gathering dust, which was not very reassuring, I have to say. But I sort of understood why that person had made that remark. We spend an inordinate amount of time writing strategies which are far too long. A strategy should be a strategy on a page. And we don't put enough time and investment into the development of our staff, the OD processes, the HR processes, the things that actually embed values and reward good behaviour. And behaviour change starts with us, not with the public. So working with Robin, we started to actually change that. We moved away from writing strategies and started to develop what we call deal training, which was based on ethnography. That teaches you, and it's, I think, particularly important when you've been trained in health and social care. You're trained to fix people. You see people as problems. It's about rewiring the brain to think really differently. That leads us on to thinking about asset-based conversations. So instead of the usual response, what we did was to actually turn it around into the organisation has to work differently. We also needed to believe in and invest in our communities. So I'll sum it up as a set of principles. It was a new relationship between public services and the citizens, communities and business of place, doing with, not to, changing the language away from a deficit model into an asset-based approach. And that builds on the strength of individuals, families, and our communities. It's having that open mind when having a conversation. We also removed tick box assessments, which tend to try and get people, raise the bar of when people access services and actually start to trust the front line to make their own judgments. And that came out very strongly when the King's Fund did their independent evaluation of Wigan. Behaviour change has to start with the organisation. In other words, we have to walk the talk. So it's about building independence and supporting citizens to be in control. Very importantly, and I return to geography, a place-based approach is important. When we were thinking about how we organise services, we tend to organise services, do we not, according to an organisational geography, as opposed to the geography that means something to local people. There are 14 townships in Wigan, some of which are actually mentioned in Doomsday. So I'll give you a guess as to which geography local people recognise and are proud of it, because it's part of their history and heritage. And when we were having this debate, the now council leader, who was the deputy leader at the time, David Mullinex, took us into the Wigan Council chamber, pointed to the ceiling and the 14 banners of the townships, which proudly hang there, and said, that's what people identify with. They say, I'm from Inns, and then I'm from Wigan, or I'm from Gall, I'm from Lee. They do not say, they don't sort of unrecognise a sort of organisational geography. So we are going to organise ourselves around the townships that people actually recognise. Now, this was an interesting dynamic for NHS colleagues, but the hook we brought in to hang this geography on was to focus on the anchor institutions in each of the townships, which of course were the two places with registered populations, schools and GPs. And when primary care networks came in, the GPs who were already working in the neighbourhood model and loved it because they had weekly huddles, they knew who the head teachers were, they often had shared issues around families. They knew who their housing officers were, they had a linked drug worker, we got the police fire service. The community groups, interestingly, already organised that like that. So it was the public service actually, public sector actually organising around the community geography. The GPs said, right, our primary care networks need to match the neighbourhoods, coterminous geography. It was a really important win, and it required some peer education amongst the GPs from the GP leadership in the clinical commissioning group. So to summarise, creating a culture where we shifted from deficit to an asset-based approach. Asset-based thinking is problem-orientated, it's about fixing problems, problems are embedded, it creates an us versus them environment, and we do to people. In other words, we're disempowering people. We see people as a problem, and people can't be trusted to make their own decisions. Shifting through ethnography and having everybody in the organisation go through that, CEO, new recruit. It started off in adult social care, and interestingly, our own older social workers said to us, this is how we were trained to do originally. We then had assessments brought in, which took away that development of relationships with people. This is what I came into the profession to do. So in other words, we'd actually got people back we'd given agency to our frontline staff by freeing them up. Strengths-based is what I can do, what can you do? It's an equal partnership. We're all in this together. How do we co-create community spirit? And people have answers. People can control their lives and decisions. And we tended to forget that, I think, in the desire to fix people. The deal, therefore, had to be an open conversation, a continuous conversation with the community. And it carries on to this day. So it's not a one-off consultation about proposals. It's a continuing conversation led through the VCSE and community groups section, through the youth parliament, through other community leaders, that continues and helps to shape and evolve the deal. So, for example, the deal has, Deal 2030 has taken on things like climate change and the inclusive economy, which came from the young people in Wigan. Very importantly, it's a philosophy, not a project, not a programme. And again, we tend with strategies to try and then translate them into programmes and projects, and forget that actually this is about a common purpose, a common mission, if you like, across a place. So the deal has 10 essential components. It has to have a strong narrative of place. And when I'm, sort of thinking about the communities you belong to, my goodness, there's fantastic stories and heritage and history. Build that into your community narrative. Have a simple concept that everybody can get behind. It's a belief, it's a movement, not a project. Leadership is distributed right throughout the whole system and society, and can be from the old uns to the little uns. The youngest person to address Wigan Council, she's now 12, but at the time she was 5, is called Ember. And Ember knew more about recycling and the importance of recycling than any adult she was addressing in Wigan Council. A 5-year-old addressing the whole council. She was brilliant and still is brilliant. Workforce culture change is incredibly important here. And this is about recruiting and retaining for values. Training and core behaviours are really important. Yes, people have to have qualifications and skills, but you can train people and give them knowledge. What you can't necessarily change always is their fundamental beliefs and attitudes, and they need to be able to go and share the values of the organisation. It is about building self-reliance in the communities, so you are fostering, nurturing, encouraging, not doing too. It's giving permission to staff to work differently, and you back them whether they get it right or wrong. That's very important. It's also about enabling staff with new technology. So there's a very strong issue around digital inclusion here too. And it's very much around having that kind of supportive shared environment so that you can get around the place very easily. Co-location is important. We often said with health and social care staff that we knew the deal was working when you opened the fridge and you found one milk bottle, not separate milk bottles that said health visitor, district nurse, social worker. They were sharing the one milk bottle. We now therefore recruit our staff to be courageous, be accountable, be positive, and since COVID, very importantly, be kind. And that goes through the entire performance management process in the council, in the recruitment and retention policies, and the reward. It's also very important to recognise that often human beings don't like change, particularly if their identity, their power, their status is wrapped up in the status quo, if you like. So you have to be prepared to have some courageous conversations, and that can be among senior staff, not just junior staff. And you have to be prepared to move people on and out. Not an easy thing to do, but it demotivates really good staff if they see bad behaviour rewarded. And you only need to look at things like the NHS staff survey to understand that. The second arm of the deal is actually investing in communities. So I referred to Barbara earlier. One of the things we decided to do was to shift some investment into both asset transfer to community groups, but also investing in communities' own ideas to fix problems. It's that strengths-based approach, helping to see the community as part of the whole system, not an equal partner in the whole system, not a set of citizens we do things to. Barbara's hub, Sunshine House, ironically and interestingly, built on the site of the house that George Orwell rented when he was writing The Road to Wigan Pier. was a dementia daycare centre. If you go there today, it is a vibrant community hub. It has little incubator businesses. It's got wellbeing centres, citizens' advice. It runs 7 days a week, usually 7 a.m. till 10 a.m. It works with DWP in terms of training and employment for people who are long-term unemployed. It's got a community laundry, a community pantry. Now, you don't necessarily have exactly the same model across all of our townships, but you have a community hub of some kind in each one, depending on the assets in each individual community. It's even expanded into delivering some NHS services, dementia reading groups, a lot of work around mental health, reducing social isolation, really key. And that Deal for Communities Investment Fund, and one of the things I did was to put some health outcomes around the Deal for Communities Investment Fund, not telling the community how to do it, but say, this is what I want you to try and contribute to. Very important, this, and we'll give you some support on that. Over £13 million has been invested in the community's own ideas, and that's brought £12 million of social and economic benefit, and a further £6 million levered in from external funding, and that continues to this day. That then went to shape and frame the approach to public health in that I was responsible for. Now, I've always said I was the person with the job title, but actually my job was to make sure every single citizen was their own director of public health. And we followed a very great grassroots movement that started in North Karelia in Finland, which was back in the 1970s when too many people were dying of heart disease. Well, that's very familiar, isn't it, to us in the UK. But the people of North Karelia went to the regional government and said, what are we going to do about it? Because this cannot continue. And they had a whole shift from being a very disease-based model to a prevention-based model of CBD, which has been well researched by WHO. Why haven't we adopted it here in the UK? Because it wasn't invented here. But we did, I'd had some exposure to it through work in Merseyside. What I said and advised the council to do is, this is what we've got to make core business. Put some sexy stuff in around Heart Start from Seattle, add in the Royal Society of Public Health, work around growing community champions. Very important to invest in community skills as well. Very cheap to do, but absolutely transformational, both for individuals and communities. And Wigan now has over 23,000 community health champions of one sort or another. Doesn't matter what brought you in the first place, but actually being involved in the programme is fantastic. And for some people, this was the very first exam they'd ever passed. For others, it was a route into jobs in health and social care. So in other words, growing your own workforce. But for others, it was just about that social connection and putting back into the community. For one young man, Joseph, it was about commemorating the loss of his sister who died from toxic shock syndrome. Joseph went on to win the National Hygeia Award for his work on sepsis and is currently studying politics and economics. He wants to do public health, but also be an MP. Thank goodness for that. We'll get some good ones coming out of Wigan. It was also about that kind of professional leadership right across the organisation to improve health. Very important to think about not health being just my job, but actually what a council does. Neil will recognise this going back into local government history. Modern, councils in the Victorian era, their statutory duty, their big mission was to improve the health of the population. The 2013 reforms in England was actually putting public health back into that ancestral home where it had done so much good work. And I'll give you a sort of lovely anecdote of how culture, the culture of professional leadership and public and political leadership really works. Damien Edwards, who was one of the councillors, went to the chief exec and said, I want a community DFIB in Sheffington. And Donna had asked him the right question, like, Damien, why, you're very passionate about this, why? And it transpired that Damien's mum had dropped dead in her 40s from a cardiac arrest. So Donna sent him to see me, and because I was deal trained by this time, I didn't say to him, where's your randomized control trial for this? I said, Damien, you're really passionate about this, but have you thought big? Let's not just think about community DFibs in Shevington. And by the way, would you like to lead our Heart of Wigan programme? Heart of Wigan being the CBD prevention programme. I'd already squared it off with Keith that Damien would lead on this. And Damien just grabbed it. He grabbed this opportunity and ran. And he was the most passionate advocate for the programme. So that when I went to health scrutiny, he'd actually got all of the counsellors, he'd embedded Heart Start training in the counsellor development programme, so part of their core development. Every single counsellor had been through Heart Start training. They knew how to do CPR. So when I went and talked to them about Heart of Wigan, it wasn't my programme anymore. Good. It was theirs. They were, this is brilliant. We love it. So sometimes it's about just thinking about culture in a very different way. One of our cabinet members, after doing his Heart Start training, went on holiday, and Chris was told me the sort of story of this. He was standing at the bar, a guy keeled over. Chris, he said, I didn't just think about it, I just went straight into my Heart Start training. He checked the guy's pulse, did CPR until the ambulance arrived, and saved a life. He was, of course, teased when he came back, but with the other counsellors saying to him, I'm sure that guy just fainted, Chris, but you went and did CPR on him. The point was, it was the headline, of course, was a counsellor saves a life. What more could you have in terms of understanding that importance of prevention? And then the sort of lessons for us in doing this kind of ethnographic, different recruitment and retention approach, and the approach working in neighbourhoods with our anchor institutions and our communities. That meant during COVID, we could just pivot the response, the approach I've talked about, into the humanitarian response to COVID. We could continue to work in that, if you like, that neighbourhood model. We could wrap around humanitarian assistance to support the communities. And we already had that community infrastructure to pivot into an emergency response. We've put a lot of lessons in place from that, including a reservist model for future emergencies. So thinking about working in this kind of very flexible place-based approach allows us to deal with the routine business and the routine business of things like health improvement and delivery of better public services, but also allows us to pivot to an emergency response to deal with major incidents. So, you know, there's a win-win there and a really efficient use of resources. Has it worked? Well, yes, a number of health indicators, including healthy life expectancy, which improved over the time whilst I was there. Had some challenges through COVID, but has continued to buck the national trend in terms of improvement. We've seen improvements to care home quality, third fastest improvement nationally in England, a balanced budget for adult social care, and reductions to things like nursing residential care, so reduced by about 15% and at a faster rate than the England average. Plus, reablement services have been twice rated outstanding by CQC, very unusual for that. And again, that kind of improvement approach to using a deal-based methodology. And a very concrete one for, I mentioned CBD, early deaths attributed to CBD have reduced by 29% for males and 25% for females. So a very significant reduction from the picture I inherited back in 2008. And that was over a 6-year period. So, you know, you don't see, people say you don't see public health outcomes for 25 years. Sorry, we did it in just over one normal parliamentary electoral cycle. There are still obviously significant challenges, which I can talk about if people would like me to, but to say that when we came through COVID, we actually had a slightly better experience of excess deaths, 1.12%, compared to England of 1.16, which would be unusual for a population as older and, if you like, experiencing deprivation than the average England population. We still have some challenges around obesity, suicide rate, and children's injuries, but part of the obesity challenge for adults coming out of COVID was because we had to step down our normal lose weight, feel great management of obesity, which again was a whole system approach and very face-to-face. That now obviously has got back up and running, and I expect the progress that was halted before COVID has now picked up. What has it enabled us to do? Respond to further strategies. So for things like the Marmot Review 10 years on, to add in community wealth building to health building and not see the two in competition. You know, health is wealth. To see a collaborative partnership between the council and, for example, the Edge Hill University and Wigan and Leigh College, moving away from, if you like, the organisational silos of training health and social care staff, to not think about teaching hospitals or teaching practices, but to think about Wigan as a teaching borough. So, in other words, that sort of, if you like, exchange of people working across in different environments, incredibly important to do that. And add in the design and co-design around climate change adaptation and the work on decent home standards. So in other words, building on the success that we've had to date, that foundation for a much more cooperative based neighbourhood model, where we do things, you know, as far as possible at a neighbourhood level, recognise where we need to align across more than one neighbourhood, and then what's best delivered at a borough level. In other words, geographies of scale. My key learning to finish off with, Sue, is you have to find the coalition of the willing. And the coalition of the willing is not always your professional silo or your organisational silo. The best people I've worked with were the citizens out there who understood intimately the geography, the history, and the way in which social connections happened in the community. That's the best way of building society. To have that telling the story of place and place-based narrative, using arts and culture, the culture of music and dance, for example, to tell that story. Infecting the NHS with wellness. The NHS was set up as a sickness service. Nye had to do that because of the what he was dealing with, particularly with the medical profession. But actually, the wellness element is better understood in local government and in local communities. The NHS is in an existential crisis for all sorts of reasons. It needs to, if you like, sort of get into a different way of thinking. That is not going to be easy, but that ethnographic training I've described is something all NHS staff should go through. So that's a big challenge, I think, for our medical schools as well, because it needs to start on day one. We've seen in exposing healthcare staff and social care staff to ethnographic training, training them in place produces a very different result. It needs to be a whole societal, whole system approach, as evidenced by Finland, and experts need to get away from thinking they're on top to being on tap. So that, if you like, that servant leadership approach is really important. And if you like, that sort of, I guess, leads me into the sense of that citizen-led public health is really important. Very much around the expert knowledge is there to support and facilitate the creativity of citizens. So in conclusion, camaraderie, supporting each other, cooperation and collaboration, that's between, within an organisation, between organisations, but very much in concert with the community themselves and being led by the community. Culture needs to actually be the driver, not the servant of strategy. And communications need to be honest, transparent, clear, and consistent. Peter Smith's legacy was having an honest conversation with the citizens he was proud to serve. And my goodness, do we not need some honest conversations right now? Thank you.
Absolutely super inspirational talk, Kate. Thank you very, very much. I've taken away so much from it. Many things actually resonate with me in things that we're trying to achieve in Wales. And we'll be hearing about those examples in a moment. But this notion that you build almost in a layered way on your success and to actually bring about this cooperative model that has got such massive benefits all around. I mean, you've evaluated it thoroughly, and there are benefits to services, to funding, to people, against hard health outcomes as well. I know there's much more to be done, but nevertheless, that story is totally mind-blowing. Thank you very much, Kate. I'm now going to hand over very, very quickly to our panel, who are going to react to this and also speak from their own experience of what we're trying to achieve in Wales. And just you should all have the biographies of the panel, but very, very quickly, just to say who they are. Neil is the Pembrokeshire County Council's Cabinet Member for Corporate Improvement and Communities. He's the chair of the Community Council in Clanrian and is very, very active in some exciting community development work there. And he's recently been appointed the Pembrokeshire PSB Public Services Board Chair. Sue is our champion of partnership working in Wales. We're big fans of Sue. She's the Chief Officer of Pembrokeshire Association of Voluntary Services, massive experience in private sector and long-standing experience in the voluntary and community sector, both at strategic and operational levels. And moving on to the NHS perspective, we have Claire George, who has also extensive experience in the private and public sectors. She's worked on projects to do with the environment, the economy, health, and has led a number of transforming systems projects across the region. And she's going to be joined by Rob Blake, who's just back from leave. So thanks for joining us, Rob. He is also well placed to contribute to our discussions because he's head of culture and workforce and has been for the past 5 years in Haldar University Health Board. So I'm going to invite the panel to say a few words. Do feel free to use the chat function. I got into a bit of a panic seeing that nobody was using it. So I wondered whether it was somehow not functioning, but I'm assured it is functioning. Do put some comments there or prepare your questions and your comments for after the panel has spoken. So I'm going to invite Neil first to give that sort of local authority, public sector response. Over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. And yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me today. So yeah, fascinating to listen to Kate. A couple of things that struck me, first of all, obviously mentioning political, the role of the political in leading culture. And I think you're quite right. Although we have organisations here today that don't have that political connection. So I think it's a wider question of leadership. You also mentioned that organizational culture starts with the organization, but I think that I'm going to talk to you briefly about how I think it starts with you as an individual. So there's a mix there, and I love what you talked about innovation as well, and that kind of led me to the point that we just can't afford to have stagnant cultures. We what we've had does not sit with the challenges that we're facing. So I thought I'd just expand upon those slightly and just give a perspective. So yeah, I mean, first of all, organizational culture. What is it? I think that was one of the questions, and it might mean different things to different people. We did quite a lot of work around this in Pembrokeshire County Council, and we kind of came up with something quite simple, which was the way that we do things around here. So it's the values, beliefs, the attitudes, and the behaviours that you would see in an organisation. And I'll be quite blunt. I mean, I was elected in 2017, came in straight into the cabinet, and looked at had the transformation portfolio, and we looked at three things: technology, culture, and relationships. So Kate touched upon this as well. That was that relationship between citizen and state, and the relationship between ourselves. Technology was a huge driver of organizational culture, because I remember I came from the private sector, worked in the technology industry, and honestly, I thought I was back in the 1970s walking around County Hall. And so technology was a real shift of culture for us. And then we made it very explicitly that it was about culture as well. So I had a role as a political leader, and I often say to people, as a councillor, I don't have power, I have influence, and you can't get things done on your own. But clearly, being a cabinet member, and I worked hard to get councillor in front of my name, so I guess there's some gravitas that comes with that. But being able to set out a strategy. So again, this question of is it culture or is it strategy? It is both. You need to be able to articulate what you're trying to achieve, and so that will work for many people in an organisation, especially bureaucratic public services. People like strategies. People like to know that they're working to something. So that is important. But what's more important, I think, is what you bring to it. So, and I've done some work, quite a lot of work around this, and I came across something recently which really landed with me, which is the Japanese concept of ikigai, which means a reason for being. And it talks about when you think about yourself, what you love, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and what you're good at. And I think when you there's a match that happens, isn't there? So you as a person have your own life. You spend a lot of time in work. Life is too short to not enjoy your work, in my opinion. And so you will end up in various professions, vocations, jobs, whatever you want to call it. And you'll probably be at your happiest and give of your best when you have a real sense of what you're bringing to the party, and also there is a cultural match with the organisation that you work for. So I think it always starts with you, and thinking about what you love, what you're good at, what you can be paid for, and what the world needs. And you can look this up, Ikigai, IKIGAI. It's really interesting, and you can ask yourself some questions about what it is that matters to you. And then I think you can think about what do you see in your organisation. And Kate talked throughout her talk was a really high focus on people, because people make the culture of an organisation. It's the values that they stand by. It's the values that the organisation sets out, and it's also then about the behaviours. So I worked for one organisation. I spent a year there, and I hated it. And it became very apparent to me very early on that my values did not align with their values. They said that they put the customer at the heart of everything that they did. They had posters all around the office saying that the customer is the most important thing. It was a complete lie. The money was the most important thing. So there's a balance with Ikigai, so you need to be paid for what you do, and there's an exchange. You sign a contract for employment. There's an exchange. You bring what you can, but it's really useful to think about whether your values align with the organisation. So I'd encourage you. I think we've got a mix of people. I recognise some names here. We've got a mix of people in various positions within their organisation, and I'd actually argue then, or ask you the question: can you shift a culture? So as an elected member, I might have cabinet member for corporate improvement and communities. It doesn't mean I can shift a culture at all. It means that I can set a direction of travel, but that still doesn't mean it's going to happen. And the working with a coalition of the willing, I call it working with the willing. I remember in the early days, just kind of thinking about how was I going to make some progress, because it felt like really hard work, and it was working with the willing. So I can see that Erin's on the call today, and she might remember the 100-day challenge that we put in practice in Pembrokeshire County Council. It was about, for me, it was about finding people that I could work with, that I could align with, finding a common challenge, and then not being afraid to try new things. So even though I had pushback from some very senior people within the organisation about my idea, which I stole from Leicester, by the way, so 100-day challenge, we had so much fun first of all, as a collective, working out a real life challenge. And some of the stuff that came out of that, we're still doing today, and we've seen a real change because of that. So, you know, for me, I want to bring enthusiasm, a can-do attitude to what I do. I want to enjoy my work, and I want to bring that in. I'm not a stuffy politician, and by the way, sometimes I hate the politics, and it stands in the way of a constructive organisational culture. But I want to work with the willing, and I've been really fortunate to do that in Pembrokeshire County Council. So can you shift the culture? Something that I worked for O2 for 10 years, which was an amazing place to work because they had a relentless focus on people. It was all about the people. We had a very permissive culture. We were encouraged to innovate. I wasn't at the top of the chain by any means, but I was able to actually shift a culture through the work that I did and the support I had from my managers, because they had similar beliefs and similar shared values about innovating and trying to do the right things. So there's something for me about whether you've got leader or manager in your title or not. I love this thing that was said to me years ago. It's your stature, not your status. So you can set a real example of what being a leader is like in your organization and lead by example. So I think to conclude, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here, be aware of what organizational culture is, be aware of what you stand for and what matters to you. See whether you can fit within your organizational culture, whether you can thrive in it. See what you can do to shift it, because I believe it rests with all of us, this responsibility. And also ask yourself the question, if it's not right, then you have one work life, you have one life, then maybe you've got to make some difficult decisions as well. So, or the right decisions. So those are some brief thoughts from me on organisational culture. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you very much, Neil. And we have a comment on your talk in the chat that from Shaheen, that your experiences resonate with her, and thank you for sharing the big question whether in fact it's possible to shift culture. I think that the message we took away from you is that there's a lot of personal responsibility here as well, and one of reflection, and that in our neck of the woods it's work in progress, but we're going in the right direction. I think that I've taken that away from you. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm going to feel free to use the chat. We've got a number. I was worried that it wasn't functioning, but there are a number of comments in there now. Particularly interested in hearing your reactions to the talks that you've heard so far. So, Sue, can I hand over to you now, please?
Hello, I'm Sue Leonard. As Sue has said, I'm Chief Officer of Pembrokeshire Association of Voluntary Services, and we're the County Voluntary Council supporting for Pembrokeshire, supporting voluntary community groups, volunteers, social enterprises. And I'm just going to say a few I mean, first of all, Kate, thank you so much for that. Your presentation, the recording of it should be mandatory listening for everybody working in public services and in communities. It should just be out there for everybody to listen to. So just a couple of thoughts from me in terms of a third sector perspective, from my perspective, really, on the basis of my experience in the voluntary and community sector. And I think, when we look at COVID, the power of what was achieved by communities during COVID, if ever you needed any evidence to show what community power can do, you need look no further than at what happened during COVID. And what we saw there was a huge outpouring of people wanting to do what they could to keep themselves safe and their neighbours safe. It was informal, it was small scale, it was very agile, there was a quick response. Everybody had a shared purpose, it was very clear. I have to say, from working with partners, there was a significantly modified risk appetite. Bureaucracy took a back seat and people came up with solutions. Technology was used innovatively, people shared their learning, and we got through. And some great things happened. So we know it can work. And during that time, there was a massive change in culture from organisations. It wasn't business as usual. Red tape fell away. People in power did not have all the answers. They didn't. And solutions came from all over the place, and actually much more quickly than governments could respond in most cases. But I think the problem is, since the pandemic, we've kind of just all slipped back into our old ways of working, and in a lot of ways, communities have, I suppose people were furloughed, they've gone back to work, so they've slipped back into their old ways of working. Communities have sort of been put back in their boxes. We've sort of gone back to looking at our old ways of working, our kind of quite tightly, our short-term grant schemes, very competitive processes, complex reporting, keeping a very tight grip, governance, silo working, risk aversion. And so business as usual is effectively just, we're at danger of losing all the ground that we did make during COVID. So so we know that, culture change happened quickly there, but it was driven by crisis. And so I've just got a few thoughts to share. I think, Neil, you just mentioned that, strategies were important, and particularly important, I think you said, to sort of, bureaucratic organisations. So, I mean, hopefully we can stop having bureaucratic organisations, and then perhaps we won't need quite so many strategies. I have lost count of the number of strategies we have in Wales. I mean, culture could eat strategies for breakfast, lunch and dinner and still have some left over. So we've got in Wales, we have some really unique legislation. We've got and we've got some good strategies, some good policies. We've got lots of them, but nothing actually changes. Things still get worse. So I think the other thing is that, so we know that strategies are not the answer, but we spend an inordinate amount of time, money and effort in writing them. And normally we just get around to writing the delivery plan, and then it's time to review the strategy again. So that's an industry in itself, and it ties you up and it wears you out. So, maybe we shouldn't have quite so many strategies. That would be a start. And then I look at sort of, again, Neil just referenced working for somewhere where everywhere said, it's all about the people, but actually it wasn't all about the people at all. It was all about the profit. So I think we get a lot of rhetoric, don't we? And when we compare it to reality, we see a huge gulf, and it's everywhere. Just to, we know that there's a commitment to person-centered working, but then really it's not. It's all about eligibility criteria and how people best fit into a system. We talk about regional innovation. We've got regional innovation forums and a commitment to social value, but we see a withdrawal of funding and for that purpose, normally because the funding that we have for that is needed to pay for the increased salary costs of people on existing projects. We've got a commitment in Wales to hyperlocal, place-based working, but we also see an increasingly complex and confused regional infrastructure being built, which ties us all up in knots and takes the focus away from hyperlocal. We always say, oh, it's really important to learn from people with lived experience, but even when we do have people from lived experience, we're far more likely to employ consultants to come and tell us what we should be doing than listen to people with lived experience. So we know that third sector is supposed to be an equal partner, but we still see funding that really is for things that happen in the voluntary and community sector being filtered through NHS Wales and WLGA. Well, we're not an equal partner, not when we look at some of the ways that the system is structured. So what we do need, and I think you've really, Kate, you've really given us something to think about that radical place leadership, and that's for all of us to think about, is how that can be achieved. We do need to work out ways of investing properly in communities. So you had a deal for communities and you looked at investment. We really do need to look at how we can make that happen. And in Wales, we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and that created public services boards. And actually, they are public services boards, so it brings together public services. Often I see them referred to as public service boards, and I always say, oh, there's an S on the end of it, it's public services. Now I'm thinking, from what you were saying, that they should be public service boards. We are there to serve the public, and it is that servant leadership we should be giving. So I'm not going to put an S back on there anymore. When I see it, I'm going to take the S off. But we have no budget. However, we do have all the public services partners round the table. So maybe a percentage of everybody's budget into place leadership. Let's start investing, putting our money where our mouth is. And I think we do need to have those honest conversations. Pembrokeshire County Council has had to make, I think it's about £80 million worth of savings over 4 years, Neil. Now is the time for that honest conversation, isn't it? Because, we are going to start seeing the closure of many things that communities value. So I think that honest conversation about how we manage that going forward. We can't call it the Pembrokeshire Promise, though, because that means something different in Pembrokeshire. And I think the other thing for me is two things, just to finish. One thing, I like the idea of letting people do the best they can. Let's move away from eligibility criteria and tick box assessments. Let's just wrap around the person and do the best we can, and invite them to contribute as much as they can to help themselves and to help others. And finally, coalition of the willing. I think we do have to find those, and I am coming across people who are starting to describe themselves as disruptors, agitators, movers and shakers. I had an email the other day from someone who described himself as a co-conspirator. And I think, all of those people that we do think, like, I can't remember, was it Barbara or Brenda, the troublemaker. The troublemakers are our change makers. So I think it's a coalition of the willing. And let's invite all of those people who are perhaps thorns in our sides to get round the table, because they do have the solutions. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts of mine. And thank you very much for your presentation, Kate.
Thank you very much, Sue. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Great, some hard-hitting comments there, Sue. And have a look, everybody, at the chat. Chris Johns, co-chair of the Resourceful Communities Partnership, says, the pandemic didn't change the culture. Maybe it caused a temporary change, but it wasn't a culture change, which is actually a good point. Anne has said too many meetings in the public sector. The private sector wouldn't work like this. We should learn from them. There should be more emphasis on action. And Neil Cockerton has got a message for you there. And Neil is saying that really this is an issue for everybody, including politicians, which is another good point, I think, that reinforces what we've heard so far. I'm going to move swiftly on to now the NHS and introduce Claire and Rob to you, who will now give the perspective of the health sector. Okay, over to you then, Claire.
Thank you, Sue. I think I'm going to address it from a kind of operational bottom up angle, and then Rob will look at it top down, really. So hopefully we'll meet in the middle. My name's Claire George, and my current role is Service Delivery Manager for Dementia Wellbeing. So I'm working across three local authority areas and one health board, and a plethora of assets in the community, including our CVC partners who bring a huge amount to the table. So some of this is what's within our own leadership and control, and some of this is about our influence of our other partners. A lot of what Kate said and my other colleagues has resonated, so some of this won't be news, but it will hopefully come from my perspective. Kate mentioned austerity. Austerity in Wigan drove collaboration. I think in other places has driven competition. As resources have become more scarce, some humans therefore have to fight for those resources. And I think austerity has been an enabler and a challenge in equal part, depending on where we're working. Couldn't agree more about honesty. I think the most important thing for me is communication. Turning up to the table is the first part. You've got to be around the table to be heard. And then we've got to, as public servants and public services, be honest about what our challenges are and share those with the people, working partners and the population, so they can be engaged in those challenges as well, because as Sue said, they've got solutions that we can't and won't conceive. I think there's something for me around what's normal. In the health sector specifically, a lot of my colleagues have a vocation. They are nurses, they are doctors, they are occupational therapists, and they've always worked within health. And what their normal is different to mine. My normal is challenging the status quo, is asking questions, is looking for different ways of doing things. I have colleagues who, but this is the way we do it around here, and what your normal is and your organisational normal will vary. I can't stress enough, and I think Sue alluded to it, how complex health and social care is. Health is bad enough. As I mentioned, I've got three county areas, and we've got one health board area. And the complexity within health is challenging without looking at those three local authorities and how each of those work, their cultures, their approach. And language is important. It's always important in communication. What makes sense to you and how you communicate it. Please test understanding. Please make sure that that message that you're emitting is being received in the way you're hoping it to be. We've got structural challenges around our cultures, and I think so that's Sue, that's the bit around the strategies. We've got too many competing strategies, so every local authority's got to have a strategy, and then the West Wales Care Partnership has to have a strategy, and then we've got Welsh Government strategies, and we've got specialist strategies. And that's just confusing when it comes to aligning our priorities together to say this is what's important, and we have those competing priorities. In health, one of our challenges culturally, I'd suggest, is around hierarchy versus equality. We have to have, and quite rightly have, hierarchy within our organisation. We have to have that oversight and check as you go through that specialist knowledge or that levels of training. However, that ultimately adds to challenges in people's ability to be entrepreneurial, creative, innovative, and to have a kind of dynamic culture, but also an equal culture. So that's often our challenge, is permission up the scale and down the scale takes a long time to achieve. I just want to finish on a few kind of people aspects. People do business with people, so how we create and build relationships is really important. How we make time for each other and spend time together, networking and building those relationships, that supports us to understand each other's roles and expectations. It helps us to respect each other's roles and responsibilities. It will help us to align our passions and our drivers and understand what they are. And it also, I think we need to bear in mind some of the idiosyncrasies of there's so many subcultures. So even within one profession or one area, you will have subcultures. And how do we communicate to people who fundamentally they've got different working environments and different ways of working? We've got the luxury of sitting here today, but a lot of my teams I expect to be sitting in a room with a patient for most of the day. And so how do I communicate effectively with them and engage them in conversations and aspirations when they don't have the luxury of being able to stick their head above the parapet, really. So that's some of my reflections, Sue, if they're helpful or otherwise, and I'll hand over to Rob for his official line.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, afternoon, everyone. So my name is Rob Blake. I'm the head of culture and workforce experience in Hywel Dda. So I was going to probably give you an oversight of what we're trying to do to create that system-wide cultural change within the organisation. And Hywel Dda is probably in a unique place. So if I'm truly honest, if you'd gone back 5 years ago, this cultural drum that we were beating around, could we change it, was beaten by myself and one other colleague. There was two of us that looked at creating cultural change in the organisation. And it's quite a vast organisation. It's a huge geographical spread. And then through COVID, actually, we were able to influence the board in giving us more resource to try and change the culture. They recognised the culture was really important and it did have to change, which is really difficult within an organisation that's so pressured and the system of work creates so much anxiety. It doesn't give you the time to create those relationships that Claire was talking about, that's so vastly needed. And from my point of view, I think we were always looking at the wrong point in trying to create that change within the culture. So I saw a great quote the other day around burnout. So they said, if you go down the caves and you've got a canary and it passes away, then you don't go out and buy a more resilient canary. But that's what we were trying to do. We were going out and buying more resilient canaries rather than understanding what was needed to create that system-wide change. A lot of that is around the organizational memory. As we've said, those cultural norms that have been built up over many, many years, the type of leadership styles that were recognized and created very command and control. So trying to break those down has been really, really difficult. But we've done it. We've created the values. We've got organizational values, as Neil was talking about. They're not espoused values. We've got a very in-depth behavioral framework that underpins that. The values are then embedded within our strategies. They're threads that go through everything that we do around our leadership development, around performance management. So the values are utilized in a number of ways. So they're just not words on a page or etched in the glass. They're the way that we work within Hywel Dda. And true values are how you act when you're at your natural best. So the values are there. We've tried to embed them. If I'm being totally honest, we started at the meso level to try and do a top-down approach, which has probably never worked to a position of embedded them as much as we wanted it to have the impact that we needed it to have. So we've looked at going at a micro level and going bottom up. So using those values, going in to specific teams and saying, what do they look like within this team? How are you going to embed integrity? What does it look like? What are the behaviors you want to see? And using them to underpin that micro level change, which is having far more impact than we could have ever envisaged. And I suppose there's been a lot of talk about innovation. And again, innovation, if you put that as a value, is pointless because it's not a verb. How can you make someone more innovative? You don't. You create the environment for them to be innovative. So for us, it's around creating safety. I think safety is a huge element of organizational culture. And then that creates innovation. It creates people to be their genuine selves. So psychological safety is an element that we're trying to do through a number of mechanisms of speaking up. We're looking at more system-wide qualitative experiences being captured. So I know someone said about the staff survey earlier. You know, if I get on my high horse about staff surveys, I won't get off it. It's one way of capturing staff experience, but ultimately going out, talking to staff, what are they experiencing on a day-to-day level, in a way that gives you more deeper, richer understanding of that staff experience, then helps you to understand where your culture's at. And then that gives you opportunities to change culture at upstream rather than downstream, which is where I think we sometimes focus a lot of our attention on. And that's why it doesn't create the cultural change that you want to see.
Hey, thank you very much, Rob. You both covered a lot in the way of challenges. The point that Claire made, that of course NHS is made up of specialists and they all have their ways of thinking and working, and we need to understand that. Issues around complexity, too many strategies, hierarchies, which, you know, in one sense, in some instances you need, but in other senses it's not helpful. And then Rob, really encouraging to see that the health board is taking this forward and taking that bottom-up approach in looking at teams and what makes teams work and what their values are and building up from that. I think it's a really good approach, very much in line with Kate's, if I can call them recommendations. And let's hope that there'll be widespread change from that. I'm going to stop there because we've had so much great stuff inputted by our speakers. And just to see whether anybody would like to, we've got a chance for a question or two. We have, Kate has made a comment in the chat that, you know, found that in the NHS there was a lot of fatalism. You know, in other words, we can't change anything, and that has to be overcome as well. Presumably, Rob, your approach is addressing that, at least in part. So has anybody got any comments or observations on what they've heard? We've heard a radical, successful, I'm not going to call it project or program, a philosophy from Kate. And then we've heard the responses and the experiences here in West Wales. And you might say, well, why West Wales? On purpose, we thought it would be interesting that our panel speakers came from the same area so that some of the issues that they raised made sense contextually to you. So anybody, I can't see all the participants, Kelly, so if somebody can trawl across and see if there are any hands up. Anybody got a burning comment to make or question, or say this is, you know, there's more to this than we've discussed so far? Ah, Hannah, I can see your lovely yellow hand. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Sue.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for a really fascinating session. We've been doing a lot of work in a collaboration that Sue mentioned, the Resourceful Communities Partnership, looking at how we collaborate better across services, across public and voluntary and community sector organisations to support community action and enable community wellbeing. And in everything you've been talking about, I think implicit is the fact that culture isn't obviously one thing, and tensions occurring where we have clashing cultures, and that has been part of, implicitly and explicitly, the some of the work we've done around how you do collaboration better and how you, Sue Leonard mentioned this, how you better enable a shared sense of purpose. I just wondered, because what we've been doing has really been focusing on the tangible actions you can do to support collaboration work better, rather than just say things like you need a good culture and you need shared, you need trust and you need good leadership, but to actually, how do you do that if you don't have it? How do you build that? What are the stepping stones and the bricks that you need? So I just wondered about the panel's reflections really on some tangible things you can do to smooth the lines between cultures. Long question, sorry.
No, and I'm going to actually put that to Kate, please.
Thank you, Hannah. Great question. And can I say we have lots of clashing cultures and difficult relations in Wigan when I first went there. So the deal was very much around getting through and breaking down difficult relationships, challenging bad behaviours in leaders as well. Couple of things that we did. We expanded the deal training across all sectors, not just the council, very importantly. And leadership development, so very strong focus on that leadership development, was specifically focused at dealing with some challenging characters. We had an independent chair of the Healthier Wigan Partnership, a fantastic guy, who used to head up the modernisation agency actually in the NHS in England. And David was he came from the private sector, by the way. He'd worked in Pilkington's before he was in the NHS. He was very good at calling out, because he was neutral and not employed in the borough. He was very good at calling out when there were, shall we say, competing egos going around the place. So you do need a critical friend to actually challenge some of the leadership behaviours. You need shared training, and you mustn't be always meeting informal meetings. You need to get to know people. It's Claire's point. You need to get to know people as human beings and what they're interested in. Neil's point about what they're interested in, what motivates them. All of that kind of, it sounds boring, but all of that kind of work is really important because you start to think about people in a very different way. You also need to get people out of their silos, so they're not always meeting in the same place. Get them out into a community, if you like, venue where they're not, in a sense, they have to leave their power and status behind. So those are some very practical things about training, leadership development, critical friend challenge into the system. And I'll leave you with, Hannah, a comment about my relationship with the local medical committee. When I first went to Wigan in 2008, we're talking about this, the local medical committee, which consisted mostly of a certain demographic, no women on it at all, wouldn't invite me to their meetings because I was a woman, and they didn't approve of female leadership. They only talked about ear syringing anyway, so I didn't particularly want to go. But I had a male consultant working for me who they invited. So I stopped him going and said, if they want to talk to public health leader, they talk to me, that you're not going. I worked instead with the local pharmaceutical committee, who were practically hammering down my door, Coalition of the Willing here. We became one of the 25 pathfinders for healthy living pharmacy. And then the dentist came to me and said, we'd like to do a version of what you're doing with the pharmacists. So we co-created a version of healthy living dentistry with them. Then the optoms came, and suddenly the LMC secretary sidled into my office one day and said, you know this thing you're doing with the pharmacists? I hear you're doing it with Barry and Joe and the dentist. Yes, Joe, I am. And the optoms are doing it. Well, we don't want to be left out. So it was called reverse psychology, wasn't it? When I retired nearly 2 years ago now, the present day LMC, who are entirely different, change of personnel, there are women on it now, very definitely. I had an open invitation to go to the LMC whenever I wanted. They would always set aside the first half hour for anything I wanted to discuss with them. They all clubbed together and bought me a fantastic, beautiful crystal vase, which has the most lovely messages of appreciation for you know, my own leadership during the 14 years I was in Wigan.
Oh,
So
that's lovely. Yeah, yeah.
turn a bad relationship into a really good one.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kate. And please look out for the research that Hannah has mentioned. It's going to be published soon, isn't it, Hannah? From the Wales Centre of Public Policy, some really great research that has been produced collaboratively, co-productively in Wales. I'm going to, as a good chair, draw the meeting to a close because it's we're a minute away from 3:30. I should be handing over to Jessie, but I'm not going to in order to finish on time. Just to, on your behalf, thank the speakers very, very much for putting in all the time and effort this afternoon. It's been an inspirational afternoon, and I hope you found it too. Please complete the evaluations to tell us what you thought. I want to thank Kelly Morgan from Social Care Wales and Jessie from Together for Change for organising the event, and the Resourceful Communities Partnership for commissioning the work. And please look out for our next two sessions. The link should be in the chat now. We've got one on 10th of April, looking at the economy for communities, building on the excellent session that Selwyn Williams ran for us. And another one on the 18th of April on asset-based community development and what's good and what's challenging about it. So thank you very much, everybody, and look forward, hopefully, to seeing you at another future session. Thank you.